Start after I play the station.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and good afternoon to the listeners and viewers of Salam Media. My name is Zunaida Moosa Wadiwala, and I am coming to you live from a rather cold, wet, and rainy Johannesburg on the 2nd of September 2020. I would like to firstly thank the management and staff of Salam Media for hosting this special broadcast and giving us the opportunity to discuss a matter which is very close to our hearts and to the hearts of many communities across our rainbow nation and across our beautiful and diverse South Africa. So joining me today is my colleague, Dr. Thomas Coggin. Dr. Thomas Coggin is a senior lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand. He coordinates and teaches property law, and his research lies at the intersection of property law and urban and spatial environment. Thomas is the joint global coordinator of the International Research Group on Law and Urban Space. He is a fellow of the Urban Law Center at Fordham University, New York. Welcome, Thomas, and thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And hello to your listeners and viewers.
The Kwa-Zulu Natal High Court recently ordered the Madrasa Talimuddin in Isipingo, Durban, to ensure that its call to prayer, or the Adhan, is not audible in the building of its neighbor's house. So the High Court granted this interdict in favor of the applicant based on the alleged infringement of his property rights. Now, Dr. Coggin, you have written an article and it was published in the Daily Maverick, and it's entitled "A Very Strong Judgment in KZN as Court Comes Close to Endorsing Islamophobia." Now, this article looks at the relevant and applicable law pertaining to this matter, right? It considers how the court actually attempted to resolve this dispute without any reference to actual neighbor law principles. So I'd like to unpack the article and unpack the law or how the judge reached his decision actually. But I think for the benefit of our listeners, I would just like to give a brief, very brief, not in actual legal terms, just a slight explanation of South African property law, right? So neighbor law is a branch of property law, and neighbor law is actually a set of our common law principles. It incorporates more general protections against nuisance law. Now, when I use the term nuisance, I'm not using the word in everyday terms. I'm using nuisance as a core element of neighbor law, which is a branch of law as we studied it, right? So neighbor law, or the law of nuisance, actually is being the core study of neighbor law. It regulates conduct whereby a neighbor's, firstly, health, secondly, well-being, and thirdly, comfort is interfered with and results in actual damage to the neighbors. So if a neighbor feels aggrieved, then he or she has two options. One is to actually apply for an interdict against the damages, or a claim for actual damages if there was, right? So basically, I think in a nutshell, that sums up what the law around this matter is. So Thomas, can you take us through the article, through the judgment, please?
Sure. So, I mean, in the article, I referred to the judgment as strange. And it's, strange in itself is a bit of a strange word to use in the context of a legal argument. But I think why I found this judgment so bizarre is because it was a classic neighbor law dispute, and despite it being such a classical neighbor law dispute about dispute between two adjoining neighbors, despite this, there was absolutely no reference to any sort of neighbor law principles, which would have helped the judge to, I think, come to a far more nuanced and balanced decision in the end. Instead,
the key word, sorry Thomas, the key
Go
word
ahead.
there you just done is the word balance, and we are guided in the law of nuisance to conduct a reasonable inquiry, and
Right.
it's pretty much like the reasonable man test in the law of dealing, right? So
Right.
I think
So
the
it's, I mean,
aspect
it's very similar to Delix in that way. I mean, and again, this is again what was also bizarre. I mean, we were dealing with an applicant who was Islamophobic to the core. He was completely unapologetic about it. And the court, what the court simply does is he lays out the applicant's bigoted views, right, and a fairly sort of narrow and simplistic, and his narrow and simplistic understanding of Islam. But then the judge fails to consider that in as much as the applicant has got a right to use and enjoyment of his property, right, which may include not wanting to hear anything, right, it may include that. In as much as that's the case, so too does the madrasa in this case, right? The madrasa also has a right to use and enjoyment of their property, and that may also include sounding the call to prayer. But inexplicably, the judge just does not consider the madrasa's interests. It's a wholly one-sided judgment. And what makes it worse is that that one side that the judge considered was bigoted and prejudiced. And that's why I also said in my article that it seems to me that the judgment almost comes close to endorsing Islamophobia. And again, I just can't imagine why a judge would do that.
You know, Thomas, it is strange because I'm thinking of the neighbor law cases that would be relevant in this. You know, the Lasky versus Showcase, Geen versus Geen, Alakas, we are so guided. It's not something new.
Right, exactly.
So honestly, the word I would use is I was stumped with this judgment, considering that it
I mean,
has precedent. But you know, what concerns me is that this should not set a precedent, you know, because it's completely the principles, the factors that we should be guided upon, looking at, for example, the locality and the characteristics of the neighborhood. I think that is one of the most, if not the most, but one of the most important factors that should be considered, followed, of course, by social utility. We are, you know, within the purport of our constitution and our Bill of Rights. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that would be applicable?
So let me go back a little bit first. So neighbor law comes from a fairly long history of case law, right? Where you have disputes between neighbors, okay? Yeah. And what our courts in the past have done is, or over a period of time, our courts have developed what you could call a set of common law principles, which are considered in a way that aims to balance out these competing interests. So some of these factors include what is the locality or the character of the neighborhood? Are we dealing with a residential neighborhood? Are we dealing with an industrial neighborhood, right? You could understand that a property owner suddenly wanting to build a polluting factory in a residential neighborhood, you know, that might be an unreasonable use of his or her property, right? And that's because it's a residential neighborhood. Other factors. Does the harm outweigh the benefit or vice versa? I'll come to that a bit later. What is the landowner's motive in making this claim of nuisance? And I mean, that should 100% have been considered, because it's quite clear that the applicant's motive here was really just Islamophobia, right? It was a hatred of Islam as a religion. And if you're dealing with an applicant with that motive, you know, you really are not going to give that applicant much time at all. Is the landowner being oversensitive? Same kind of question, right? Is the landowner simply complaining because he doesn't like his neighbor? That's a total possibility, right? It doesn't mean that what the neighbor is doing is unreasonable or not. Are there less restrictive measures that are available? So can you turn down the sound of the call to prayer, for example? Here, you know, the court could have drawn on a very similar case decided 21 years earlier in Cape Town. It was Garden Cities versus North Pine Islamic Society. And here
Thomas, because it's because of the similarities.
Right. So here in that case, we had a situation where you know, the issue in the case wasn't about the call to prayer. It was about the fact that the mosque in question was using sound amplification equipment. So in other words, it was louder than it could have been, right? And here the judge, I mean, it just didn't enter the judge's mind that you could ban the call to prayer, right? It was all about well, what is reasonable? Is it reasonable for you to use sound amplification equipment? And here the court essentially said, no, it would not be reasonable for you to do so, and that you could just simply say it normally, right? But the court again just doesn't even draw on this case at all. Other questions to consider: is it practical to prevent the nuisance? Right? In some circumstances, you may have no other option but to commit the nuisance. Right? So let's say we were dealing with a hospital that was next door to you, right? You may complain of a nuisance that comes from an ambulance, right? That sort of starts its siren as it leaves the hospital to go and save someone, right? Is it practical to prevent that nuisance? You may say that yes, it is practical, because you can maybe just start your siren a few blocks down the way. But on the other hand, you may say, well, no, an ambulance needs to sound its siren almost immediately so that it can tell people that it's coming, right? So in other words, it is not practical to prevent that nuisance. Again, that's just another factor that you put into this pot in trying to consider, well, what is reasonable in the circumstances. Two more. Has the complainant come to the nuisance? So in this particular case, the complainant moved into Isipingo Beach in 1966, and the madrasa opened up, I think it was in 1999, if I'm not mistaken. So here you could say that no,
Thomas, I don't know if we've lost you. I don't know if it's on my side, but how do I check? Mute yourself. Yeah, I think we've lost Thomas.
Yes, I'm here. I'm back.
Okay, good.
All right.
Just going to panic.
So yeah, I was saying that has the complainant come to the nuisance, right? So you can understand that if you are someone and you move into an area, right, and there is already certain practices in that area which annoy you in various ways, it's the law isn't going to regard your claim as particularly reasonable in that regard, because you move to this area. Okay, so let's say you move to an area that is adjacent to an industrial area, right? You can't really turn around and say, well, I don't want this industrial pollution anymore, because you moved there, right? You knew that was the case when you moved there. So this may be an argument that the complainant may have, but again, it's you need to chuck that into the pot, right? And consider various other factors that may influence the decision. The final aspect, the final component to consider is whether there is any social utility to the harm. All right. Now, I'm really fascinated about this idea of social utility, because it sort of asks, well, right. I mean, is this harm, so to speak, is the action? Oops. We back? Sorry. Great. No worries. Is the action complained of any kind of social utility, right? To the, I guess you could say, the neighborhood as a whole. And this is something that I'm really interested in from a constitutional point of view, right? For me, this factor would bring in the fact that, well, not only do you have a right to freedom of religion, right, in terms of the Constitution, but you could also say that because you have a right to practice your religion in terms of Section 31(1) of the Constitution, because you have a right to practice your religion, it would be quite something to say, well, you can't do that anymore, right? The social utility of that harm would be particularly beneficial because it is constitutionally protected, right? Because your right to practice religion is constitutionally protected.
Yes.
Did you hear what I said there?
I did. You spoke about the,
Okay, cool.
I'm just going to repeat for emphasis, but we on the constitutional protection of religion.
Right. So you see, I mean, the action isn't just an action, right? The action has got constitutional significance to it. Okay. The call to prayer is a way is a component of practicing Islam, right? And so it's not just
Sorry,
say again.
Thomas. I'm going to interrupt you and tell you it's not just a component of Islam. Actually, the call to prayer is the most fundamental call to the prayer. So the prayer is everything in Islam, the most important part. And the call to prayer is such a simple, it's just a reminder that, hey, you know, whatever you're doing, it's time to stop now, leave your busy life and just turn to worship God for a little while, for a short while.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It's actually something, so it's a positive, you know, it's not even a negative,
Right.
call. The word in itself, the essence, the meaning of the words are just so peaceful. Come to prayer, come to success from amongst the words.
And what you've just described is the social utility of that harm, right? It's got significant social utility to your right to freedom of religion and your right to the practice of the religion, right? So that is something that you also chuck into the pot, right? In terms of considering, right? It ends up, I think, being a fairly significant component of the broader consideration, the broader balancing exercise, okay? And I say that it ends up being a fairly big component of it, not only because of its importance, right, but because it is constitutionally protected, right? And our constitution, as the supreme law, we in the law we are expected to give constitutional values the most important weighting in any kind of consideration, because it is the supreme law. And so we should be very, very wary about saying that you cannot practice your religion, right? Because it is constitutionally protected for that exact reason. And again, I mean, the judge just didn't even really consider this at all. And again, it's bizarre to me that he didn't do so. You know, at best, I mean, so the applicant called Islam a false religion, right? And I mean, it's problematic enough that this was even entertained by the judge. But I mean, at best, the judge says, well, you know, that's clearly false, that it's a false religion. It is a religion. But you know, I mean, he allowed the applicant to express his Islamophobia in a way that's completely unchecked. I mean, this one of the things that really struck me was, so one of the applicant's complaints was that he said that the madrasa had turned Isipingo Beach in Durban into, quote, a Muslim enclave. And this went completely unchallenged by the judge. And it strikes me as bizarre that it went unchallenged, especially given our history, right? Our history of spatial apartheid, where the apartheid government specifically sought to move groups of people into specific areas, right? So in other words, you are de-enclaving places, right? And turning other places into specific enclaves for specific groups of people, right? Our constitution obliges us to move away from that history, right? And so to allow an applicant to call Isipingo Beach a Muslim enclave and to let that go unchallenged is I think unacceptable.
Absolutely, Thomas. I think you've hit on so many important points and so many, just, you know, it baffles, aside from looking at it from a legal stance, it does baffle even the layman looking at it from that point of view. You know, now, another factor that I did talk about earlier was the locality of and the characteristics of the community, you know. So because of our history, our apartheid history, and because of the fact that we had so-called Indian communities and white communities and different communities based according to or classified according to different races, you know, there wasn't a problem in the past. I take the neighborhood that I grew up, for example, where we had a mosque, we had a church, and we had a temple. And there was so much of love and tolerance amongst the religions. So nobody complained about these type of things, that the adhan or the call to prayer is disturbing, or something like that. In fact, I think it fostered love amongst us, the fact that we were all sort of thrown together in that way, So I remember particularly the church bells ringing on a Sunday morning. It was something I was familiar with. I never looked at it as, oh, it's Sunday morning, it's something that's going to disturb my one day of rest type of a thing, The temple, they had a similar sound that would come 7 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock in the evening, if I recall correctly. They had their certain times or whatever. But the fact is that it endorsed or it fostered love amongst the community. Now, the Adhan in particular also fosters love in the community, in the sense that it unites the people in prayer. So people at the time of prayer would gather in the mosque, stand, shoulder to shoulder, and bow and prostrate before the one God. And amongst others, it shows that in the eyes of God, we are all equal. Now, if you look at the consequences of such an action, it might not seem like it at face value, but if you just consider it, I mean, it tells you the importance of brotherhood, the importance of fostering community. What else, if we haven't learned from our history, what could be more important? If you look at the effects of COVID and the social distancing that it's brought about and the isolation, it reminds us that how we are social beings, and we need our neighbors, and we need our family members, our community, in essence, around us. So this type of judgment is breaking away from that type that took years of fighting for our freedom, and it took years of perfecting our constitution and perfecting our laws, and so many cases that have laid precedent towards love and let love that we get from our cases, that type of principle. That this judgment has seemed to have breaking away from all of those positive effects. And it's disturbing to me, Thomas. I don't know, what are your views?
No, I mean, I think, we have to understand that, the South African city is a diverse place, right? There are people from all different faiths, people of, of no faiths who do not believe in any particular deity, right? There are people of all different genders, races, sexual orientations, etc., right? And the city becomes this beautiful melting pot of diversity, right, in which we all individually express our community identity in various ways, right? Now, you might not agree with with the beliefs of a particular community or the practices of a particular community, but you have to understand, I think, that we live, because we live in a diverse society, we have to tolerate, right, these expressions of community identity. And I mean, that to me is what the Adhan is all about, right? It's about that expression of community identity, and because our constitution recognizes the diversity of our country, I think perhaps one of the most outward manifestations, perhaps, as you mentioned, of the Islam faith, of the Islam community, is perhaps the Adhan, right? And so if you're saying to the Muslim community, no, you have to keep that to yourselves, right? If you're saying that to the Muslim community, then what are you saying about the Muslim community, right? Are you saying that the Muslim community is less than other communities, right? And also, what are you saying about the broader city as a whole, right? Are you saying that you believe that we should have sort of individual enclaves, right, where we each keep to ourselves? No, of course not. I mean, look, having said that, right, I mean, so what was also interesting in this case was that this wasn't the first time that the complainant had made a complaint. He had made a complaint all the way back in 2004 to the South African Human Rights Commission. And the South African Human Rights Commission sat down both with him and the madrasa, and they decided to work out some kind of solution that was amicable. And one of the complaints I think that he had was that the Adhan went off at 3:30 in the morning, right? Now, I don't know how true that is, but if it is true, right, you could say, well, that might infringe or other people's use and enjoyment of their property, because most people are asleep at 3:30 in the morning, right? But and at the same time, you're supposed to say, the Adhan is an important part of the madrasa's use and enjoyment of their property, right? And so you can't just say, I don't want to hear it. Like you can't just say that. What you can do is you can find a solution that that enables the parties to still be harmonious neighbors, right? That's ultimately what you should be doing as a judge. You should be you should recognize that, look, these two neighbors are at odds with each other. How can I get them to some kind of a solution where they are harmonious neighbors, right? I think the HRC report did that to some extent, and I don't think that the judge did this here. Instead, the judge simply said that, yes, the applicant has got a strong argument. I'm going to rule almost entirely in his favor. And I should also mention, the judge didn't actually grant an interdict banning the Adhan, right? Instead, he granted an interdict banning the Adhan beyond the boundaries of the madrasa's property. But I mean, that's as good as banning the Adhan, right? Because the Adhan is going to go beyond the property, right? So yeah, I just thought I should mention that. I mean, and I should also mention that. Go ahead.
Okay, so from what you've been talking us through, it's almost as if the neighbor had, or the applicant in this case, had discrimination against Islam and strengthening the whole Islamophobia. Now, part of South Africa, look, there's no place for racism in South Africa. The executive, the legislature, the judiciary has a duty to ensure that there is no place for racism in South Africa. So I just wanted to make that, so clear that it stems away from everything that we hold dear.
Yeah, look, I mean, the law can't stop someone from having bigoted views, right? I think it's quite telling that the applicant actually represented himself in this matter. He didn't have a legal representative representing him here, and I was thinking, well, maybe that was because no lawyer worth their salt would take on such a ridiculous case. But I mean, the point I was trying to get at was that the law can't prevent someone from having bigoted views, but a judge can certainly not allow an applicant to use the court to express their bigoted views. It's if I was a judge, I would simply say no. You cannot express this bigoted views. This is you are subject to the Constitution, and the Constitution recognizes religious freedom. It tries to move away from a society based on discrimination. And for you to just so blatantly come into to a state institution, to a court, and to express such bigoted views is unacceptable.
Thomas, we're doing very well for time. It's now 16:28, excuse me. So we've got about 30 minutes to go. Perhaps we could discuss, the Kyalami case, or any of the cases that that you would like to use to illustrate the beauty of our Constitution and how it ensures protection and how it looks at the balancing and the reasonableness of, matters that or applicants that have sort of, and how rights and responsibilities are enforced by using our Constitution and by using our case law.
Sure. So I think that you should understand that neighbor law is often used as a tool against diversifying neighborhoods or against diverse neighborhoods, right? And the argument is essentially that the arrival of, or the practices of, a group of people who are different to me in various ways, be it religion, be it race, be it class, etc., right? That the arrival of this group harms my property values, essentially, and my use and enjoyment of my property, right? And I think it's important to recognize that although your property values, your use and enjoyment of your property is important, in a constitutional setting, your property rights may take a backseat, to other considerations, right? And our court has been explicit about this. This is partly because, I mean, if you look at the Constitution, if you look at Section 25 of the Constitution, which is entitled Property, right, you will see that the Constitution does not mention a right to property, right? And so theoretically, you have no right to property, right? You have attendant rights, you have related rights to property, but you don't have a right to property in itself, okay? The Constitution does, however, it is, however, explicit about granting you a right of access to housing, for example. It is explicit about granting you a right to practice your religion, right? And I think we have to recognize that in this melting pot that I talked about earlier, right, that these other considerations come into play, that your property rights are not absolute, okay? They can be limited for in pursuit of a broader good, okay? And that broader good can be many things, including the right to practice your freedom of religion, all right? And it may be that in some circumstances, your use and enjoyment of the property must, as I said earlier, take a backseat to other kinds of considerations. And so that's simply because, you know, if we think about our Constitution as a kind of transformative project, right, which I believe it is, a transformative project from our very tainted past to a future that is based on diversity, that is based on respect for the many different groups of people and interests that exist in our society, then we have to recognize that some entrenched interests, that various entrenched interests, right, including property, might need to take a bit of a backseat to other considerations, right? And again, I think this is why I really like neighbor law, because neighbor law is very much about looking at, I mean, it does look between two property owners, right? But it is looking at your use and enjoyment of that property, right? And it is trying to make a balance, it is undertaking a balancing exercise between these divergent interests. I mean, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think we're so fascinated from this, the two of us, because obviously we're both partial to neighbor law, but you know, like looking at the cases, the different ideas that come up in your mind when you understand the factors and when you look at it from both sides, and when you consider the relevant factors. I mean, it's not to say that each and every factor has to be considered for each and every case, which is part of the beauty of our law, because you would look at it on a case-by-case system, but at the same time, we are guided by other cases, previous cases and precedent and that type of thing. So, you know, the fascination is definitely there to see, to you know, to balance, to engage in that balancing exercise. I think it's a responsibility on the judge and on the person who is actually conducting such an exercise. It's a huge responsibility because the consequences can be so far-reaching. But it's, you know, it's to be undertaken with that sort of attitude that, you know, it should be fair, and it should be done reasonably and responsibly.
I mean, it's you know, it's, I think you almost have to see it as a bit of a mediation role, where
Yes.
where you've got, you know, you've got two parties who are whose relationship is very acrimonious, but at the same time, you know, these are not two parties who, after the case, are going to go their separate ways, right? These are two parties who still live together, right? And their relationship also emulates other relationships, right, in that same community, right? And so you need to craft a solution that that not only recognizes the fact that these two people will still be neighbors, and therefore you need to create a harmonious solution that that tries to make both sides as happy as possible, right? But you also have to recognize that that what you're doing is, in a way, it's setting precedent for the neighborhood as a whole, right? I mean, if you're saying, I mean, if the judge had actually used neighbor law principles and had said, nevertheless, the Adhan should not be sounded at all, right? That, I mean, that could set a bad precedent for the neighborhood as a whole, because what is the judge then saying about that neighborhood, right? The judge is essentially saying that, well, that the neighborhood is about sort of, I use the term monochromatic communities, right? So it's it's very sort of a very sort of monocentric kind of community, right? That harkens back again to apartheid. I mean, if you look at I mean, there were districts in Joburg, Fitas was the one, and in Cape Town, District 6, right? I mean, part of the reason why the apartheid government, I think, um, had it in, especially for these two neighborhoods, is because they were often quite mixed neighborhoods, right? It was they were vibrant neighborhoods where people from all over Joburg came, right, to partake in the offerings in these of these neighborhoods, especially as far as Fitas is concerned. I'm not so sure about District 6, but certainly as far as Fitas was concerned.
You see that, and I hear stories about people saying, oh, in the old days, Fitas was this and that, and they talk so fondly, and their memories are so. I mean, I just
Yeah,
they talk
exactly.
about it with longing almost for that past. That's how
Right.
much they enjoy being part of that community.
And a lot of that, a big reason why was because it was a diverse neighborhood, right? And people were unashamed, I mean, rightly so, about expressing their identities in various ways, right? And people, not only tolerated diverse identities, right, but they also celebrated the fact that this was, the small little neighborhood was such a melting pot of diverse cultures and traditions. And so, we should be loath to endorse a judgment that tries to undo that in various ways. And I think, again, going back to the Adhan, I mean, and that point I made earlier about the Adhan being a very sort of outward manifestation of Muslim identity. And you're not when you're doing that, you're not saying that that the Islamic religion is better than any other religion. I don't believe that's what's being said, right? It's simply an outward expression of an identity or cultural practice, and that's how it should be viewed. And so to restrict it is, I think, very unfortunate. I mean, let me ask you, if you were a judge, and let's say the Adhan was being played really loudly, and that the sound amplification was being used, and let's say the first call was at 5 p.m. and let's say, I mean at 5 a.m. in the morning. And the complaint from the neighborhood was that, look, this is just too loud. It wakes me up in the morning. What would your judgment be?
Thomas, honestly, I would apply the reasonable factor as stipulated by the law of nuisance, and I would start by looking at all of the factors, and I would weigh them. If I look at considering the locality, as I did mention in the beginning of this interview, that I would feel one of the most important factors to consider would be the locality and the nature of this particular neighborhood. So looking at this particular neighborhood, it is predominantly an old, I'm saying old as in an apartheid Indian area, right? And which consisted of multiple religions, but predominantly Muslim and Hindu and Tamil faith, right? And I would consider that based on that, this madrasa being old and this masjid being old as in established under apartheid, what was the reason behind it? Consider that in light of the neighborhood, I would find that this is a greater factor. Then I would consider many other factors, and one of them would be the heightened sensitivity of the applicant. How many people are complaining about the Adhan? How disturbed over all the years have you looked at it? I mean, how disturbing is it to the community as a whole? Is it fair that one person is complaining about something which is of importance to the greater community? I would definitely consider that. I would most certainly social utility in light of the Constitution, and the Constitution being the supreme law of the land, the Bill of Rights being there for the protection of, both parties, weighing up in that way. I would definitely look at that. I think already you can see where I'm heading with my judgment. And I would consider the community's feelings in this regard. And that's one of the great surprises that I found out of this judgment, was that you would think that this matter would cause discord and disharmony in the community, but surprisingly enough, it has been a means of drawing the community closer. The names escape me at the moment, but the members of the tactical community have sort of banded together in praise and in support of the Muslim community, where they've actually broadcast the Adhan from their cars. They had a motorcade and they drove through the streets of Isipingo in support of the Adhan being called out. So I was touched beyond words that the community could rally together for something. And the sad thing is that we're fighting over or fight over something good, prayer, a time of COVID, a time of a war, a pandemic. So I think if we are going to fight for something good, what are we showing to the future? What are we leaving? What legacy are we leaving to the children of tomorrow? Honestly, this is something that it's a futile argument. And another thing I'd like to clarify is that you see the Adhan is different according to different times of the year and different times, different seasons. For example, in the summer months, here in Johannesburg, the Adhan would sound at 4:30 a.m. So looking at it that way, it's a fairly early time. But if you look at the community, they okay with that. Nobody has a problem with the Adhan being something that's disturbing. There haven't been any cases of neighbors complaining and saying the Adhan is disturbing us, that type of thing. So if you look at a different community now, if you look at a community under apartheid, which is classified as a white community, up until today, unfortunately, okay, now post-apartheid, masjid and masajid have sprung up in those type of neighborhoods, right? Unfortunately, their adhans are not loudly sounded. So a person living in that type of, now that we have freedom to live wherever we want to live, a person living in a neighborhood like that would not be able to hear the adhan despite living in close proximity to the masjid, to the mosque.
And what do you think about that? I mean, is that, like, I mean, so let's say Houghton, for example, right? Houghton was formerly whites only neighborhood, and it's now significantly mixed, right? And there's two beautiful mosques which have recently been built in Houghton. I live in Norwood actually, so I live right by it. I mean, so what if, for example, one of the mosques were to start sounding the Adhan? I mean, and there was a complaint from neighbors, right? How would you resolve that?
So, I think they have sort of reached a level of compromise in Houghton particularly, where the residents there have a receiver. The receiver broadcasts directly from the mosque into the homes of the person, whoever, of the Muslim residents, I suppose, whoever subscribed to the receiver. Right. And I suppose that's how they reached a compromise. And now that is what the whole point of our constitution and our democratic South Africa is all about. Now, if you consider the neighborhood and the characteristics of a neighborhood like Houghton as opposed to a neighborhood like Lenasia or Isipingo Beach or something, then you see the differences in there. In that the old Indian old Indian neighborhoods rather. Catered for the Adhan to be called out loud and catered for that type of thing. So I think understanding and respecting differences and to weigh out the importance of that particular right that you have. I mean, basically, it comes down to our rights. We are talking about rights here.
But you see, I mean, I guess what I was kind of trying to get to is that if you have a right to practice your freedom of religion, which you do, and if you live in Houghton, then why can't you sound the Adhan, right? I can understand that it might not be reasonable to do that early in the morning, but during the day, why not?
You know what? I'm all for sounding the Adhan, but I obviously am partial to that. But I really, I suppose you do have a very valid point in that case. Yes, definitely. Why not?
You see, and I say that because, again, if we're about diverse communities, I mean, and if diverse community means that there is a significant Muslim population living in a community, then part of that would surely include the sounding of the Adhan. I mean,
that's why it has to be weighed. It has to be weighed case to case, Thomas.
It does.
It has
Yeah.
to be looked at individually, neighborhood to neighborhood, but being guided by precedent and being guided by our constitution. So it still comes down to the same, I would still hold my same view with regards to the Isipingo Beach neighborhood, that being a predominantly, a neighborhood where predominantly the Adhan was always given loud, then that should be allowed. And if you look at a neighborhood like Houghton in particular, then look at the changes, look at how the population that has changed and all of that. And yes, that's the beauty of our law and the beauty of our unique country, So
yeah. And you see, I think if we looked at Houghton and the Adhan was called, it would be a grave mistake, and it would be incorrect to say, well, this is now an indication that Houghton is now becoming a Muslim enclave, right? Rather, it's a recognition that we live in a diverse country, that we are beyond spatial apartheid, right? That people can live wherever they want to live, right? And part of living wherever you want to live means that you can practice your culture or your tradition or your religion in various ways. And also that it is important to do so as a way of solidifying community identity, right? Otherwise, there's this expectation that, well, you can be who you want to be, but just make sure that you don't let anyone else know about who you want to be, right? That you sort of keep it behind walls. And again, I don't think that is the foundation of a diverse and pluralistic democracy like our own. And I mean, in many ways, I think South Africa is quite lucky that we are a diverse nation, and I think that for the most part, I think people respect and appreciate that diversity. I mean, I used to live in the States, and there, for example, I mean, if even just I mean, in New York City, which is a fairly liberal city, my friend Yusra, she was from Saudi, and she wore the hijab, right? And she used to get such abuse when she was on the subway because she wore the hijab. And I think at the very least, I don't think we in South Africa face the same kind of closed-mindedness, generally speaking.
Oh,
I think that
definitely not. I can say that with conviction, definitely not.
Right.
One of the things that springs to my mind from listening to you talk now, Thomas, is that, part of the responsibility of the judiciary is to shape people's thinking. So, and I feel so honored that, I chose this field, because if you look, I mean, the interim constitution, I think it was 1993, so 20 plus minus 23 years or 24 years since we've passed the interim constitution to 2020 now, right? And if we find instances of discrimination or instances of intolerance towards something like this, based on religion, based on racism, any form of discrimination, of course, is not allowed here in South Africa. It shouldn't be allowed anywhere in the world. But the judiciary, the lawyers, we have that responsibility to explain, to shape by setting, by promoting, first of all, by making it, okay, it's a three-party thing, the executive, the judicial, the legislature, but the judicial, in enforcing it, has that responsibility of shaping minds and clearing misconceptions.
I think that it's a brilliant point that you make, and I think it's especially important when you consider that the legislature is often sort of mired in politics, and the executive is often just mired in policy, and is probably just generally too busy to think about what is it that the law should be doing, right? And the law plays a very important role it can play a very important role in shaping our society, but that's why judges have an especially important role here, because they are confronted with the everyday reality of life, right? They're confronted with people who bring disputes to them, right? And they're asked to use the law in a way that that is not only able to resolve that dispute, but that sets a broader message for society. And they generally have more of the space, both the intellectual space and the time to do that, right? To sort of think about, well, what is the problem here? What is the law here? And how can I interpret the law in a way that gives effect to the Constitution? And again, I'm going to bring up the Constitution here because I think we often forget about the Constitution in some ways, right? The Constitution is the supreme law. It is our in our pluralistic society. We have all these different interests, right? That do disagree with each other in various ways. The Constitution is the one document which sets out the values of our nation, right? The values of our society going forward, and part of that is non-racialism and non-sexism, right? But it's also a non-discrimination, right? And so, again, it's I can't really see how the judge failed to have this in mind.
Thomas, when I look at the Constitution, I don't just simply look at the Constitution. To me, it's a piece of history. When I look at the Constitution, I sort of have a line in my mind. I look Constitution, then I look interim Constitution, then I look Codesa, then I look apartheid. It's a reason that we have reached this Constitution. And I think everybody understand it in that light.
We also must have, as you said, right, that the Constitution emerges from our history, right? And it was a difficult and a really painful history, right? And so, like, the fact that we got to this point of view, to this point in our history, should mean that in our ordinary everyday disputes, that we value and that we position the Constitution as being a beacon for how our society should go forward.
A great symbol of what we've endured as a nation, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes left, Thomas. If there's anything you'd like to say to round up, particularly pertaining to the judgment.
Particularly as it pertains to?
Particularly pertaining to the Isipingo judgment, the particular matter that we're talking about.
So look, I certainly hope that the judgment is going to be appealed. It would make sense to appeal it to a full bench of the Kwa-Zulu Natal High Court. I don't think that it's ready to go to the Supreme Court of Appeal yet. And that's simply because I just don't think it was grounded well within the appropriate law. And I would hope that that when it is appealed to wherever it is, either the full bench or indeed the Supreme Court of Appeal, that the appellate judges consider this matter from a nuisance point of view, from a neighbor law point of view, right? And
which other point of view could it be considered from, Thomas?
It's a neighbor law dispute.
Exactly. Property law is what it is.
Yeah, the judge cited case law, but the case law that he cited was just, it was very general. It just had it was just not grounded in the correct law. He cited the Prince judgment, which broadly speaking, I suppose, relates to religion. But I don't think that he used that particularly well. But I digress. I was hoping that I hope that when it is appealed, that when the appellate judges do make a decision on the neighbor law, that they do so in recognition that this dispute is not simply a dispute between two different neighbors, right? That it's very much about, it very much addresses a broader issue about diversity in our communities, right? And more so than more so than diversity, it addresses the outward manifestations of community identity, right, in our neighborhoods, right, and that we should, again, we should be loath to repress those expressions, including in insofar as that expression is in the Adhan itself. Yeah, that's really what I wanted to say.
Well, I have every faith that if it is taken up an appeal, that it would be looked at from that point of view.
Yeah,
And
I mean, what I think one of the problems maybe is that, again, the applicant represented himself. So, even if it is appealed, I'm not sure how that would work, insofar as the applicant representing himself. Maybe he'll continue to represent himself, but if he does, and if he continues to spout, such Islamophobic views, and he loses, then I expect that he will lose. Then I would certainly hope that costs are awarded against him, because it's, I mean, this, you don't just take such a bigoted view and to court.
Thomas, it is 2 minutes about 2 minutes to go until we cut off. I would like to thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Who would like to read Thomas's article, it is available on my, it's available on Twitter. You can just search at Zunaida.mw, and the link would come up, the link to the tweet that I tweeted, and the link is in there. I don't know, how else could we get your article, Thomas?
I mean, I think that's probably going to be the best way. I mean, I think if you just Google my name as well, it should come up somewhere in the news. It is on the Daily Maverick website still.
Okay, so Daily Maverick website, Google, and so I'll spell Dr. Thomas Coggin. It's THOMAS, and Coggin, COGGIN. And I think it's very important and very interesting that people actually read this article. It does explain it in such a beautiful way, in such a simple way. So thank you so much once again, Thomas.
Thank you for having me. I very much appreciated the chat.
Same, likewise, Thomas.
Okay.
And thank you to Salam Media for hosting us.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.